Cool. Alrighty, let's get started. Thank you everyone for joining our Rice Travel Institute's webinar today on navigating ethical quandaries in international dating, a discussion on ethical dating while traveling and the role of for-profit agencies. And we're very excited in the next 15 minutes or so, be exploring the ethical considerations inherent in forming romantic connections while traveling, including issues of cultural sensitivity, power differentials, and exploitation. And we're so honored to have Dr. Julia Mazzaros and Dr. Monica Liu to be joining us today and sharing their expertise on this very topic. So let me give a very brief introduction to on Dr. Monica Liu's background. So Dr. Monica Liu received her PhD in sociology from the University of California, San Diego, and she's currently assistant professor of justice and social society studies at the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota. Her work examines global internet dating and cross-border marriages between women from China and men from Western countries. Her work has appeared in academic journals such as Men and Masculinities, Qualitative Sociology and Science, Journal of Women in Culture and Society. Her monograph, Seeking Western Men, Email Older Brides Under China's Global Rise, Standard University Press, was published in November 2022. And then Dr. Julia Mazzaros received her PhD in Global Social Cultural Studies with an emphasis in sociology and gender studies from Florida International University. She's currently an associate professor and graduate student coordinator at Texas A&M Commerce University. Julia's work examines masculinity, globalization, and gender within the international dating and romance tourism industry. Her work has been featured in academic journals such as in Gender, Place, and Culture and Women's Studies Quarterly. Julia's forthcoming monograph, Masculinity, Male Older Bride, and Women's Labor, Global Economies of Gender, Rutgers University Press, will be available in 2025. We're so excited to be reading it when it gets published. Julia currently serves on the Rice Travel Institute's team as our event manager. So very excited about the conversation, but before we dive in, I would love to give a very brief introduction of Rice Travel Institute for those who are unfamiliar with our organization. So I'm gonna just share a few slides and then I'll just pass the stage onto Dr. Julia and Dr. Monica. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. But I'm unable to, for some reason. Sorry, let me just start again. All right. Okay. It's not showing right.
It's showing your Canva, yeah.
And now is it
It's showing my presentation.
I cannot move my presentation for some reason. This has never happened to me before. Let me see what's going on. Sorry about that. I'm just gonna download the PDF and show from there. Maybe that's easier. Sorry about technical issues nowadays that happen at almost every webinar, isn't it?
I know, right?
Okay. Yeah. All right. So I should be able to show this one now. Okay. Can you see the PDF?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
perfect.
Yes,
Perfect.
about Rice Travel Institute. Yes.
Yeah. So sorry for wasting a couple of minutes. Okay, so Rise Travel Institute is a 501(c)(3) nonprofit organization founded in 2020 with a mission to create a more just and equitable world through travel education. We envision a world where travelers practice and promote responsible, impactful, sustainable, and ethical travel that uplifts global communities and protects the natural ecosystems, in addition to all the benefits that travelers enjoy when they travel. And so our approach to our educational programming really focuses on systems thinking, understanding the interconnectedness of all issues around travel and sustainability and justice. And speaking of sustainability, we really focus on the justice piece within the holistic sustainability framework. And instead of just talking about the environment or carbon, counting, we also emphasis on the social impact and environmental justice impact on vulnerable communities around the world as we travel as a result of tourism. And then we also focus on indigenous tourism and understanding the power dynamics between, the global extractive tourism industry and the host communities in travel destinations. And we're also taking the colonial approach, making sure that we're creating equitable and inclusive relationships in the bigger global tourism industry. And so our programming focuses on our online education programs and courses. We have cohort-based programs and short courses, including the flagship program. We have one experiential journey per year for our flagship program alumni, giving them the opportunity to practice conscious travel in, like firsthand conscious travel practices. And also we have educational resources such as a blog, a podcast, and events like today's webinar. And just very briefly about some super exciting events that will happen in the rest of the year. On the 18th of June, we're going to have a conversation with the journalist Paige McLennan on her new book, The New Tourist, Waking Up to the Power and Perils of Travel. And on the same day, we'll be celebrating our 4th year anniversary, connecting with all the tourism professionals and travel enthusiasts who care about sustainable travel and responsible travel in New York City. And then in summer, we're going to announce a few new programs, including carbon literacy and climate justice program, certification program, and a study abroad program, etc. So we are going to announce, when these programs are launched this summer. And then in October, we will also be screening the award-winning documentary, Hidden in Plain Sight, The Real Cost of a Safari Lurks in the Shadows by Rachel Levy. And yeah, so this is just a snapshot of what's going to come up in the rest of the year. And we'll, of course, continue to, interview people on our podcast, specialists on our podcast, and continue to publish new articles on our blog. So please stay tuned. And by signing up to our mailing list and follow us on LinkedIn. So I am gonna just like cut this intro very short because I'm really excited to hear what Dr. Julia Mazzaros and Dr. Monica Liu have to share with us on their expertise today. So I'm gonna pass it on to you, Julia.
Okay, thank you so much for the wonderful introduction and the opportunity to organize this webinar for RISE. I'm really excited to share my expertise about this with a new community of folks who are involved in similarly different, interests such as travel. So I'm going to share my screen and can people see my screen? Sharing. Okay. Can folks see the screen? Okay, now it's loading. Okay. All right. Thank you. So, obviously, with globalization, global dating has become a thing. And prior to kind of internet technologies, we had what was known as the quote unquote mail order bride business. And it kind of started of what we think about as mail order brides today in the 1970s with pen pal catalogs that were largely based in the Philippines and other parts of Asia, I think, but mostly in the Philippines. And these catalogs would have women's photos and addresses, and people would send letters. And then in the 1990s, with the rise of the internet and the fall of the Soviet Union, you see a shift towards Eastern Europe and online formats. So, this is when Russia and Ukraine become popular, as well as other sites in Asia. And then from there, a lot of companies moving beyond correspondence offer romance tours, which are these facilitated travel experiences, typically just for single men who are interested in marrying women from countries typically in the global south. And for that reason, it's kind of been characterized as this very exploitative industry. And we'll get into a lot of the different ways that the industry can be exploitative. Um, One thing I will say that international dating tends to be focused on marriage, and this is how it kind of differentiates itself from men who are involved in sex tourism. So the industry is often considered a conduit for human trafficking. There were two high-profile murders in the late 1990s in Washington State here in the US. A bride from the Philippines and a woman from Kyrgyzstan who also married an American man were both murdered by their husbands. And because of that, Senator Maria Cantwell from Washington wrote the International Marriage Broker Regulation Act with a partner from the House of Representatives. And it passed with bipartisan support in 2005 and was signed into law by George W. Bush with the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. And what IMBRA does, so international marriage brokers are defined as companies that charge men a fee to participate in their services, but do not charge the women. So your typical Match.com would not be considered an international marriage broker for that reason, because both people have to pay. Either both people have to pay or both people have to be free in order for the agency to not be considered an international marriage broker. Um, the law also limits men to two K1 fiance visas in a lifetime. The woman who was murdered in Kyrgyzstan, who was from Kyrgyzstan, Anastasia King, her husband had already had a wife who came over on a K1 fiance visa before her and had filed domestic violence charges. And then he was already in the process of bringing a third woman from a different country. I don't know which one. And so, for that reason, the law limits men, American men, to only two K1 fiance visas in a lifetime. It also requires men who sign up with these agencies to undergo background checks within the sex offender database and other databases to see if they've been married, if they have children, etc. And then the law also requires resources for women in their language who migrate about domestic violence, shelters, and other resources that are available in the new country where they're migrating to. And so this law has been around now for almost 20 years. The impacts of this law, originally the industry was against this law. It said it was a invasion of privacy. And in the beginning, right, as I pointed out with catalogs, they used to sell women's actual physical addresses, which now we think of as crazy dangerous. And looking back on it now, even industry people that I've interviewed have realized that that was probably a safety risk, and that they were very lucky that these guys never just like showed up to women's houses in Ukraine or the Philippines and did anything really crazy, at least that they knew of. So the law, in one sense, helps vet, right, the men and make sure that they don't have serious criminal backgrounds. And it actually also helps the industry, because the industry gets to maintain the control of the correspondence that these folks are involved in. And so that gets monetized within the industry. So it's not allowed for, if we're talking through this monetized website, that most of these websites are, for me to give you my personal email address. That's not allowed. There's a program that will delete that email address or any kind of personal information from being shared, right? And so that is also, the industry says it helps them keep people safe, but in reality, it also helps them make money. Some recent developments that kind of have been going on in the past couple years. With the development of TikTok, you've seen this whole movement grow called passport bros, which are men who are going on their own without any kind of agency or company, and they are just using dating apps. Once they arrive in these countries, a lot of men are going to Colombia, Dominican Republic, Philippines, but there is a more inherently danger when you are doing these kinds of things, because there's no vetting on either side, right? Obviously, these dating apps are not covered by the International Marriage Broker Regulation Act, so nobody has to be vetted. And a lot of these passport bros are increasingly becoming targets of violence. So 8 U.S. citizens were murdered in Medellin, Colombia in the last 2 months of 2023. And that is through the dating app method, where they have someone catfish a guy by pretending to be some attractive young woman on a dating app. And then when the man shows up, they will rob him. And there is a drug in Colombia that people use called scopolamine, or devil's breath, that if they rub it into your skin or blow it into your face, it kind of makes you a zombie. And you are taken to an ATM, you withdraw your money, and then they just kind of leave you there and you fall asleep or something. But these kinds of incidents of violence are more likely to happen when people are obviously going into these situations without a lot of knowledge or vetting of people. Um, Also, in the industry, a recent development has been the war in Ukraine. And this industry tends to thrive during political and economic kind of life crises of women in countries like Ukraine or the Philippines. And the people in the industry will tell you themselves that it is much easier to make marriages happen and to meet women during unstable political and financial times. A lot of women have already left to the EU as refugees, but many of them cannot afford to stay if they are not working. And so one big thing a lot of agencies are doing now is trying to match, Ukrainian women with local European men on the ground in the countries that they've refuged in. Also, a number of agencies have completely shut down. Most of the agencies that were competing with the main agency that I followed, which is called the Foreign Affair, they have shut down. They were mostly started by American men who had kind of married a Ukrainian woman and were trying to compete with the larger, American-based agencies, and they kind of have folded with the war. However, local matchmakers that I met on the ground in Ukraine, who were typically Ukrainian women, who were actually doing matchmaking, looking at intake forms and using psychology and personality stuff to actually match people based on some sort of shared interests and background. Those folks still continue to work, but they have spread out. Some are refugees in the moment, but they are still trying to connect folks online. So I know of a matchmaker already in Portugal, Romania, Germany, and then of course some obviously have stayed in Ukraine during the war. All right, so my own research on the industry, I followed the agencies that are International Marriage Broker Regulation Act compliant. So everybody who I interviewed were, willing participants. So I began this work in 2010. I followed 3 different romance tours from the Company of Foreign Affairs. I followed a romance tour in Colombia, one in Ukraine, and one in the Philippines. The other agencies I mentioned that were kind of set up in competition who were trying to kind of do tours as well were Dream Connections and Match Guarantee. Those have, I think, both closed. Dream Connections for sure has. And then the boutique matchmaking agencies, For Him Dating, It's Possible, Prime Matchmaking. And also I talked to affiliate marketing websites, people who ran affiliate marketing websites. So previous studies on the industry, Nicole Constable is one of the first scholars to really look at this industry, and she looked at brides coming from China and the Philippines. And she was really trying to show that women were not victims of trafficking, that some women want to participate in these kinds of romance, and that all relationships are kind of an exchange, and these people are just much more upfront about the exchange that they're going to make. And that a lot of women, particularly in the Philippines, were willing to exchange their reproductive labor in exchange for more financial stability. Another study by Felicity Schaefer looked at women who participated in romance tours in Colombia and Mexico. And her research talked about how women in Mexico tended to be more middle class, while women in Colombia tended to be more working class, and kind of the different expectations that class can create amongst women and what they're looking for in men abroad. And she pointed out the importance of cosmetic surgeries for women in Colombia and how they were trying to market themselves to American men. So I was really kind of looking at the men who participate in this industry, right? And kind of the mass why are they interested in an industry that is seen as potentially being exploitative or a form of human trafficking. So a lot of the guys involved tend to be conservative politically, and they really identify with traditional gender roles and the heteronormative family ideal. Most of the guys are white. A lot of them are divorced. A majority are 50 plus. The median age of the men I met was about 53 years old. So many of them were boomers or Gen X. For the younger guys who joined the industry, there are definitely kind of undertones of incel culture, Andrew Tate, all of this kind of misogynistic content that has been really kind of bubbling under the surface since 2016 of a lot of young men's communities. So men, obviously, when they're looking for women abroad, this can be an exploitative situation. So, they typically are looking for women to do the traditional feminized labor that women in the West, they think are not willing to do, which in reality, right, marriage historically has been exploitative in that way for women's labor. but there are definitely potentials for abuse. I did meet one woman who, while her husband did not necessarily physically abuse her, he would do things such as turn off the car when they would have arguments, or turn off her credit cards, and did very controlling things. She eventually divorced him, and then he died from injecting his own homemade Botox in his house, which I thought was an interesting side story. All right. So there is this idea that there is a lot of potential for inauthentic relationships, right? 90% of the industry is online, what they call keyboard Romeos in the industry. But that makes it easier to monetize these kinds of situations, right? Where you can have chatbots and AI, and actually the largest company, Anastasia Day, is working on AI dating. When it's $8 per message or $3 a minute to chat, it can become quite lucrative. And a lot of people are happy with living in this fantasy versus in having a real relationship. All right, some final ideas about different flows of people who are looking for this kind of women's intimate labor. We have these romance tourists who I focus on, but they often overlap and intersect with romance tourists and romance retiree migrants. So in the Philippines and in Colombia, I met a lot of men who were retired or planning to retire there because of the lower cost of living and more access to younger women's labor. And so these guys tend to go to similar geographic spaces where they have relative affluence. There is the availability of women's labor, and the cost of living is cheaper than in the global north. And this is kind of a new form of imperial reach with a new type of gentrification that's kind of happening with digital nomadism and exploiting vulnerable populations, right, who are poorer than you. All right, so some ethical issues to think about within the industry, the role of capitalism. These are intimate industries. We are increasingly commodifying intimate relationships, right? Because loneliness and access to the kind of women that these men want is not so easy to gain, and so they are willing to pay for it, and that's inherently exploitative on both ends. And some of the issues and ethics surrounding the men involved, right? Men felt that they were maybe being used, and that they were using this relative affluence to gain access to women that they normally wouldn't have access to. And they are, a lot of them, knowingly exploiting global economic stratification to get what they want, to find a younger woman willing to do the reproductive labor of the home. And a small percentage are looking for the truly vulnerable, right? Looking at the war in Ukraine as an opportunity to find a woman. All right. Finally, with women, love, oftentimes in the West, we think of love as being this romantic notion devoid of economic considerations, but not all cultures think about love and marriage in that way, right? Many cultures think that men are supposed to provide financial stability, and are enforcing the responsibilities of patriarchy. A lot of people would argue that Western men want the benefits of patriarchy without the responsibilities. And the pressure of filial piety is strong in places like the Philippines, where a lot of women are expected to send money back to their families to help support them. And obviously, women have a lot of different reasons for joining the website. Maybe they just want to practice English, go on dates. Maybe they want to find a husband. But these are different ethical reasons of why you might join or why you might not. And we'll talk about these larger ethical questions later. And now I want to make sure Dr. Monica has enough time. So I'm going to stop.
Hey, hello everyone. Just let me pull up my slides. Oh, Julia, do you think you
Julia,
could
would you?
share
Yeah,
so I
I was gonna say the same thing. Yeah, there you
okay,
go.
great. Okay, can everyone see my slides okay? Okay, awesome. And can you hear me okay? Great. All right, well, hello everyone. So that was a great the first half of the presentation by Dr. Masaros. So now I'm going to continue by sharing some of the findings I came up with through my research. So a lot of this research was recently published in my monograph, Seeking Western Men, Email Order Brides Under China's Global Rise. So we'll just go over some of my findings. So different from Dr. Masaro's research, my research focused on global internet dating and cross-border marriages, specifically between Chinese women and Western men. And let's just take a quick look at the courtship process at the particular dating agency where I did my research. So usually the men and women would meet online, and there are translators to translate for the men and women's email exchanges. And usually when couples meet online, they'll exchange emails for a few months. All of the emails are translated by translators at the women's dating agencies. And if everything goes well, the man will actually fly to China to meet the woman in person. Occasionally, I've seen couples get married on the spot, but more often than not, if they like each other, after the first meeting, they'll continue writing for a few more months, and then the man may travel to China a second or third time to marry the woman and bring her back to his home country. Now, in terms of my research methodology, I did a total of 20 months of ethnography, which means observation and interviews in China. This was over a long span of time. I started when I was first entered graduate school in 2008. And this research went all the way up until 2019. I would spend my summer and winter breaks there, and I did 1 year of continuous research on a Fulbright scholarship in 2011. And all of this was done in 3 different offices of a multi-branch translation company in China. And as previously mentioned, I interviewed the men and the women and also observed them. I also interviewed and observed both the translators and the managers at these dating agencies. Now, let's take a closer look at who some of these women are. So contrary to the popular media depiction of marriage migrants as young and never married, actually the majority of the female clients in my study were middle-aged, and many of them were actually divorced. So this is a different demographic group of women, and they also came from very different class backgrounds. Some women were actually very, very wealthy. They had a net worth above $1 million US. I had a large number of middle-class women as well, and I had working-class women. Now, in today's presentation, I want to talk a little bit about the industry and how the industry and the translators do their work. And I also want to dispel a couple of common media stereotypes of the industry that may not represent the truth. The first issue is of human trafficking, which Dr. Masaros previously mentioned. And I would concur with her finding that what I saw on the ground is that this global internet dating and cross-border marriage is not associated with human trafficking, in that this is a completely voluntary process. And the dating agencies where I studied, actually, they would call themselves translation companies instead of matchmaking companies. And the reason is their purpose is to provide a platform for people to meet. The translators don't actually select who the women can contact, and they don't tell the men who they can contact. People are free to contact each other. And when the women receive the men's emails, the translators will actually forward those English emails to the women's mailbox. And these days, with the online translation software like Google Translate, the women can read the men's letters directly. And then in the translation process, in fact, the translators often would ask their female clients to provide information for the translators to translate from Chinese into English. And it's actually oftentimes the women who disengage during this email translation process because they feel that they've paid a high membership fee, so that the translators are then responsible for completing a surrogate dating for them so that they don't have to write the men themselves. So in fact, it's actually the translators that are more proactive in getting women to reply to the men's letters in Chinese themselves, rather than pushing off the responsibility to the translators. Another way by which this industry, right, has no sign of human trafficking is that, in fact, the companies actually are very, very careful in not overstepping the women's boundaries and not creating a situation where their female clients are unhappy, because in China, global internet dating agencies and matchmaking companies are actually officially illegal. And because the agencies enlist themselves as translation companies, the government allows them to exist. But the government is actually pretty vigilant about the safety of these companies, and they would often just shut down agencies when women file complaints. So I had witnessed some dating agencies shut down when the women file a complaint that they've paid a high membership fee, but they have not met a husband, and they believe that the company is swindling them. So the company where I did my research, in fact, some female clients, they don't even pay their full membership fee, and the dating company does not actually go after these women. They don't pursue these women. Instead, they would change the fee structure so that the women are paying in a lump sum upfront rather than in separate installments, because the company, right, does not want to get into lawsuits. So in fact, right, the agency, because of their murky legal status, they are actually forced to structure the company in a way that empowers the women so that the government does not go after them. And another thing I had observed is that these companies actually do a very good job of protecting their female clients so that the women don't complain. So for example, they often would recommend both parties to get STI checks before any kind of sexual contact. Interestingly, they would recommend the women to actually engage in some kind of sexual trial with the men if a decision is made that the couple will marry, to test for sexual compatibility, because in fact, a lot of these men who come through these dating agencies, many of them are in their 40s, 50s, and 60s or beyond, right? They actually suffer from erectile dysfunction. So the company will make sure that the women are aware that this could be a potential issue before they get into a marriage. And finally, the company is actually very good at flagging men who may be in the industry, who may be in the business for sexual pleasure and not seeking a serious relationship. So for example, while I was doing research there, I had observed a divorced male client who was in his 60s doing business in China. And the translators felt that he was seeking free sex and free business connections from his female clients. So as soon as they saw that, they immediately warned future other female clients not to invest money in this guy's company or marry him, and they actually canceled his membership. Another thing that the company makes sure the women does not do is that the women are also not taking advantage of the men. So for example, sometimes when female clients ask for extravagant purchases from the men, the company will step in. I witnessed the company say to one female client, if you're not planning to marry, right, this man, then why are you asking him to buy all the stuff? You're pressuring men by dragging them out to the most expensive department stores and making it embarrassing for them to say no on the spot. And as a company, we're really worried that these men are going to file a complaint, and our partner company who recruits the Western men will think that we are encouraging women to trick men for money. Another thing that they want to make sure is that women remain faithful to the men. So, for example, one female client whom I witnessed having a Chinese lover at the same time she was engaged to a Western man. One day I was walking with this woman down the street, and we ran into one of the company managers. And when we engaged in a conversation, the manager actually said to this woman, right, you should love everything about a man if you're planning to marry him. You can't just treat this American man as your ATM machine and then go to bed with another. He has traveled to China to visit you multiple times, spent a lot of money on you. So if you put yourself in his shoes, you don't want to be treated the same. You would not want to be treated the way that you're treating him. And finally, another thing that I had observed is that a lot of these translators, because they're so involved in the translation of the email exchanges, they actually get very much emotionally involved. And sometimes it's actually hard for them to detach their personal identity from their professional identity. So, for example, one translator at one point has said, I feel like the woman that I write for, and I think of her man as my own boyfriend. Another translator said, seeing clients get married feels as if I've just created a new baby. It feels great. And another translator says, sometimes when the men leave China and I see him crying as he gets out of the taxi and walks to the airport, this makes me feel so sad. And because the translators, right, so much of their emotions are poured into this very intimate type of job, some of them feel that their female clients, when they see the female clients not treating the men right or vice versa, right, they can actually feel embarrassment, guilt, or sadness. And because of that, they may actually refuse to work with a certain male client or female client because they feel that continuing to work for these people would be against their personal moral standards. And another thing I witnessed is that for a lot of the management staff, this kind of work, getting intimately involved in helping people date, getting to know them on a personal basis, has become a source of friendship and inspiration and passion for their life. So it's not just a job; it's become an important part of their life that they're really passionate about and invested in. So, for example, I had attended a company meeting where they invited a lot of clients to come and talk about their experience, and many of the managers were there. So one of the clients at this meeting actually spoke up, and she said, on the day before her manager's major surgery, so the name of this manager is Miss Fong, this client said, Miss Fong made phone calls to each one of us to give us personalized guidance on how we should date and how we should respond to the men's letters. And this is because she wanted to make sure we're okay, just in case after this major surgery, she woke up again. She never will wake up again. So as this client spoke, tears actually rolled down her eyes and everybody clapped. And as a researcher, for me, that was a moving moment. And so all of these things that I witnessed at this company has shown me that I didn't see any signs of human trafficking. I feel that the company is actually serving as the moral gatekeeper to keep their clients in check in order to promote the smooth functioning of the business, and also to line up, right, to align the ethics of what is happening with their own personal moral standards. Okay. So I'll stop there to make sure we have enough time for discussion.
Okay, thanks. That was excellent. So I guess the one thing I wanted to quickly say before we kind of open it up to like more specific questions is there's this larger question at play of how, what are the ethics that are required when we think about these for-profit entities that are facilitating relationships, right? Whether it's a dating app, whether it's a matchmaking agency, whether it's a correspondence-based website situation, right? Um, all of these different ways in which we are facilitating relationships, especially across borders, right? Where we might not have the social networks to meet people. So people will jump on an app or use a third-party facilitation, whether it's an agency, a matchmaker, etc. So how ethical can these relationships be if they are facilitated in these for-profit spaces or by these for-profit entities? And what does that mean? How do you navigate ethically dealing with these, recognizing that it's a for-profit entity and all of those things, obviously, and when you're going and traveling abroad with different racial, class, economic backgrounds, how do you navigate that, right? So those are kind of the bigger questions, and I would like to open it to the audience too, and Vinci as well, to see kind of what are your thoughts about these ethical issues. I'm curious how other folks are thinking about it as well. Like, I'm more of interested in a dialogue. There's like no right answer, so I'm curious.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Julie and Monica, like for these fascinating presentations. I have learned a lot, and obviously, just as anyone in the travel and tourism industry haven't who hadn't had like a lot of knowledge about what this industry is like, then oftentimes we have these misconceptions about them being like or like kind of similar to or like being like having human trafficking involved or in one way or another. So I am really happy today to hear both of you help debunk these myths a little bit. And what Julia and Monica, like the examples that you gave were very different, right? In terms of how the more traditionally, how this industry started off with like, men, usually like men from more affluent countries seeking marriages and relationships in the global south, whereas now like the case in China is like wealthier women or women from different classes, like who are older, who are experienced in relationships and marriages, are seeking alternatives, through this new translation industry, or what do we call that? And so it's super interesting. And I'm just wondering, like, if both of you could share a little bit about what your take is on, or maybe some advice for the community, because here at Rise Travel Institute, we delve into the ethics of different issues within the context of travel, and we're just wondering, with the rise of digital nomadism, with like people being able to stay longer in other countries, and we also have connections with travel writers, tourism professionals, like journalists who would be like on the road for years and not being able to, I mean, oftentimes would express the loneliness and not being able to develop long-term relationships. So what are some advice or ethical considerations that you would have for people like who want to involve in more like informal, uh, you know, uh, I don't know, romantic relationship forming, or anything that you think we should be thinking about as we travel across borders in terms of like, all the power dynamics that could be at play, your race, your nationality, your social economic class, gender identity, and so on. So yeah, would you like to share a little bit about that?
Hello, Kitty. Do you want to go first, Monica, or do you want me to?
I think I'll take a moment to think, but I think there's also a question in the chat box directed for me.
Oh, perfect. Okay. You want to?
Yeah, so I'll just tackle that one, the one about Chinese having a long tradition of marriage brokers and how this tradition is reflected and manifested in the current situation. So as I mentioned in my presentation, because in China, the global cross-border matchmaking is actually officially illegal. So the dating agency where I conducted my research, they make very clear that they're not a matchmaking agency. They are just they're not marriage brokers. They are translators, and this is a place where you come and meet friends, and that friendship can take in many forms, right? Like it's a place where you seek out relationships, not a place where they're necessarily brokering. They're just translating, they're just doing cultural translation and communication. And I think that in terms of tying this in with the China's traditional of marriage brokers, I think even in Chinese society today, because everybody is using apps, because parents no longer have as much of a say in marriages as they used to, because in China marriages are no longer arranged. I think this traditional idea of having a marriage broker just in everyday life in contemporary China has drifted away as well, and that is uncommon today to have that traditional matchmaker role. So I think what the dating agencies are doing is in sync with what people are doing in their everyday lives, meeting on apps, and usually family and friends. They serve as introducers, right? They might know somebody who knows somebody that may be a good match for you, but the individuals themselves will make the decision on who they are attracted to and who they want to date.
That's a good
Thank
answer
you.
for that
I'm
question.
just curious, like, piggyback on the previous question. I'm just curious about the trend, which may not be a trend anymore, but like, the phenomenon about Chinese men importing brides from less affluent countries. And what about that? And does the government, regulate or have any regulations on that? Just curious.
I'm not sure how much regulation the government has on that. To my knowledge, there isn't that unless it's done in a way where it's a child bride and it's some type of purchase or some type of human trafficking. Because China does have a leftover men phenomenon where a lot of rural men who are left brideless because a lot of rural women have migrated to the cities, and then they come from poor families and not very many people are interested in marrying them, and so China is dealing with that struggle, and importing brides from even less developed economies, that's a way to resolve this problem. So I think that the government is actually in support of that practice rather than opposed, just to resolve this potential social issue that could lead to conflict.
Right, absolutely. I mean, I can totally see the government's position in like supporting this or be in favor of this. Just wondering if there's any measures in place to make sure that human trafficking is not really, happening while this is taking place. But yeah, this is very interesting conversation. Thank you for your insights. Julia?
I was just going to say, a lot of times, the laws that are passed to prevent human trafficking actually create more instances of it or make it easy. Does that make sense? In a lot of ways, a lot of legislation has unintended consequences, right?
Mhm.
Right.
And so, for example, like one unintended consequence of human trafficking legislation in the Philippines, also this industry is technically illegal in the Philippines, right? So they also have friendly, you know what I mean, similar to what Monica was saying. But for example, if they think a woman is going to be an irregular migrant somewhere abroad, they'll just not let her get on a plane. So they like live, but it's for your own good, so you won't be human trafficked, right? So there is and there's always tensions when the state gets involved, but of course. But yes, I will say the IMBRA, International Marriage Broker Regulation Act, really does work in the sense that the US really won't approve many of the visas that are filed from non-IMBRA compliant like matchmaking agencies. So you really want to So yeah, but in terms of digital nomadism, I guess I would say, back to the original question while we have a couple minutes.
Yeah.
I think, learning the language of where you are would be an important first step in establishing a real, genuine relationship. One critique I would see a lot of these guys was that they would go to these countries and expect women to speak English, and never really bother to learn the language. So my first, if you want to have a real genuine relationship with someone, you got to make an attempt to learn their language at least a little bit, at least a little bit. And especially if you're living there as a digital nomad, you should be trying to integrate
Regardless. Yes.
regardless. Yes. And learning basic polite culture about where you're living. What are the expectations of, meeting people's families, bringing gifts, you know what I mean, taking shoes off, the polite norms of society of where you are and how to treat people, I think is an important, at least first step to kind of decolonizing a lot of
Oh,
the stuff
yes.
that's been happening. So
Thank you for bringing up the word decolonizing, the way in which we interact with local people when we travel, whether or not we're talking about a specific context. But yeah, thank you so much. And I'm just wondering because do. I ran into some personal like scenarios where when I was volunteering, when I was working in the Saharan Africa, like many years ago, and I was approached by a number of local men, and of course like back then I was like much younger, and also it was very hard to actually understand like or actually gauge whether a relationship is genuine and how much because of the power dynamics, because of my intersection of identities and so on. So it's a very complex thing to navigate. And so the reason why I asked the previous question is a lot of our professional contacts, they are travel writers, they are like, they would be like on the road for years. And, sometimes they would be wondering like, okay, what is the ethical thing to do? Especially when we come from countries where notion of marriage or our expectations might not be the same as where, the people that we meet where we go, right? So just wondering, I mean, there's a lot to think about, obviously, in terms of ethics, whether it's like about the for-profit agencies or like in a more intimate, like informal setting. And so, Julia, would you like to maybe share a closing, thoughts or
sure.
remark, like using the last 2 minutes?
Sure. I will say a lot of the relationships that I saw that were kind of facilitated, that were more long lasting, through these kinds of, different channels where people really did try to make an understanding of the local culture. And so, for example, guys in the Philippines, one thing, if they were married for a long time, would recognize, okay, I do have to help this woman's family, right, financially speaking. And whereas in the US, people be like, oh, they're using you, like blah 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 blah. There it's kind of like, if you're going to take on a woman there, this is the responsibility of what you're going to be taking on. And a lot of the men kind of recognize that and were okay with that. And so I think, right, understanding once again these like cultural dynamics about the family and courtship and all of that kind of stuff, where you are headed, is so important. So
Thank you so much. I'm just looking at the clock. I think time is up. I want to be mindful of everybody's time. But thank you so much, Monica and Julia, for this fascinating conversation and for educating our community on your expertise. And also thank you for everyone who called in, and some other people who have signed up but not being able to make it. You will receive a recording of this conversation in a couple of days in your email. So thank you so much for everyone's participation today, and stay tuned for more exciting events and initiatives at Rise. And we'll have the conversation continue. Thank you so much. Very enlightening talks indeed. Thank you. Thank you.